Hello again. Over the last few decades, the history of Europe and Africa has been revolutionized by the analysis of human DNA. This has been supplemented by exciting new discoveries in ancient archaeology. So it is that on the one hand, archaeologists have discovered that the Neanderthals, who were living in Europe and Western Asia 150,000 years ago, before the arrival of modern humans, were far more advanced than had previously been supposed. They had built the earliest structures in Europe, were manufacturing glue, weaving ropes, and producing cave art before Homo sapiens turned up. At the same time that this was being revealed, studies of the human genome showed that people in Europe have inherited DNA from the Neanderthals, including genes relating to the architecture of the brain. It is beginning to look as though far from Homo sapiens coming to Europe and introducing all kinds of wonderful new things to those primitive Neanderthals, the case might be quite different. It may be that they actually learned from the Neanderthals, who were in some ways more advanced than the newcomers. While this was happening, the Homo sapiens were interbreeding with the Neanderthals, and this too was beneficial to them, making modern Europeans a kind of hybrid species. I leave aside the question of the so-called Denisovans and will make this the subject of a separate video. All modern people outside sub-Saharan Africa have therefore benefited from the cultural and genetic heritage of the Neanderthals. In Black Africa, the case is quite different. Although traces of Neanderthal DNA have been found in people living in places such as Ethiopia, this is present in much smaller amounts than in Europeans. It was introduced as a result of Ethiopia and Eritrea being part of an empire based partly in Arabia, partly in Africa. It was a backflow of Neanderthal DNA from what's now Saudi Arabia and Yemen. As we move further west into Africa, though, even these minute amounts of Neanderthal DNA peter out. Instead, the DNA of an earlier and more primitive human species is found, what is known as a ghost population. The chances are that this was Homo erectus, one of the earliest types of human. It is thought that populations of this early species lingered on in Africa, and just as Homo sapiens were mating with the more advanced Neanderthals in Europe and Asia, so too were those in sub-Saharan Africa interbreeding with a very primitive type of human. Up to a fifth of the DNA in some parts of West Africa is from this early type of human. There is confirmation of this from some skulls which have been found in West Africa, for example that from Iwo in Nigeria. This dates from about 13,000 years ago and shows a mixture of modern and very primitive features. It looks as though a modern human has been crossed with a primitive species like Homo erectus. All this presents us with an intriguing point, which is that most of this interbreeding seems to have been in that part of West Africa which is the ancestral home of the Bantu peoples. This is the very location which is the origin of modern populations, black people who are now living in Europe and the United States. The transatlantic slave trade took people from this area, and the ancestry of all African Americans and Caribbeans lies in that area. What this means is that today, in both Britain and America, the population is in the main of white European stock, those whose ancestors inherited useful genes, some relating to the brain, from the Neanderthals, and that they are living side by side with those whose own genetic heritage is far more ancient and primitive. Whether this has any effect on the behaviour and achievements of these modern populations with very different backgrounds is an interesting question. although some would say it's hard to see how it could fail to be the case.